Talk about and build from now. There's people that I've coached in the past who didn't want a co-founder because they didn't want to share the power, but then they end up not getting anywhere because they didn't have enough power themselves. My name is Damon Brown of DamonBrown.net. My main thing is to help you as a side hustler, a solopreneur, otherwise a non-traditional entrepreneur. Today we're going to talk about co-founders. I've had a couple, and how do you negotiate and get a good co-founder agreement? This is a contentious territory because so many things that we create, particularly as solopreneurs or side hustlers, we came it up with it in our own brain, or we were chatting with some friends and we came up with a great idea. Those things have happened to me several times. Some of them you will never hear of, but other things became Cuddler, became, the Bites as Entrepreneur, became So Quotable, became these things that I became known for. How you negotiate and how you navigate co-foundership is worthy of talking about a lot. And it's some territories where you need a co-founder, you need that support. But sometimes we can be afraid of bringing on co-founders because we don't want to lose what we got, or we don't trust people in that way, or we're afraid to frankly share some of that power. As I talk about and build from now, there's people that I've coached in the past who didn't want a co-founder because they didn't want to share the power, but then they end up not getting anywhere because they didn't have enough power themselves. So we're going to talk about two big things that you want to think about as you bring in co-founders and as you work towards this. There's by no means exhaustive. I'm not going to get into legal advice. There's so much stuff. Please get a lawyer if you do decide to get into the co-founder game. But with that said, I think there's two big things you want to think about as you bring on a co-founder. Number one is that every single agreement is finite. I love Seth Godin. I love Seth Godin in general, but I love his argument and discussion about this. He says that every co-founder agreement, as in the contract, whether it's on a napkin, as we saw, I believe it was Facebook had their stuff on a napkin, it's on a napkin, or it's legally drawn up, as it was in the case working with my lawyer with some of the intellectual properties that I've worked with, it's still binding. All of them are finite. And I love Seth's take on this. Seth's take on this. I promise it's not a toke. Seth Godin's take on this. He says all of them are finite for two reasons. One of the founders decides to leave or passes away. And founders are bought out sometimes where they figure out how much this company or idea is worth. And then the remaining founder or founders pay the other founder, and the other founder leaves with their cut, right? They leave or they pass away, natural attrition, if you want to be PC about it. So they leave, or as was the case with me, the business itself is bought and they're no longer founders. My last startup was called Cuddler. It connected people for hugs. It's the startup that I'm most known for. It came out in 2014, and we sold it in 2015. So it got really popular really quickly. We bootstrapped it. So when people wanted to acquire us, companies wanted to acquire us, it was just a matter of us divvying up whatever profit price they were offering and then splitting it three ways, because I had two other co-founders, and going our separate ways. Relatively clean. But how we split up and what we owned as far as the startup, that discussion happened right after we launched. So the two co-founders were already involved. I became a third co-founder a little bit later on, but before we had launched, and I ended up being the COO and the CMO essentially. And I ended up guiding the launch. So I came on fairly early, but I wasn't the original co-founder. We did it. That first week, we had 100,000 users and 10,000 people who completed Cuddles, which was the impetus of the app, which was similar to Tinder and Grindr. So with us doing that, all of us realized it was going to get big really quickly. It was already big. It had been out for a week. Literally, we had 100,000 users. It was crazy. So we started talking. I initiated the conversation. I'm like, listen, we need to figure out how we're going to split this up. Now, we could have had the discussion earlier, which might have been a little cleaner, but it still wasn't popular enough so that it was an issue. And it still wasn't making money like that, which makes it even more contentious when a lot of money gets involved. So we spent about 3 weeks to a month negotiating what parts we owned. Some back and forth, not too heated, but it was definitely some discussions. And then we were like, cool, Charlie owns this part, then this part goes over here, blah, blah, blah. Damon owns this part. No problem. We already had that in writing a month after we launched. 6 months later, the acquisition calls started coming in. What wasn't contentious is what we owned. And so when we got to a dollar amount that sounded good and we sold the company, it's like, all right, the agent that represented us gave us a separate checks based on the contract and the agreement that we had done months earlier. But imagine if we hadn't done that and then money gets into the picture. I used to live in Silicon Valley. I've heard the horror stories from the lawyers that I've worked with to people who have had their own startup tragedies, for lack of a better term. And people end up being in court for years, trying to get stuff sorted. I love Seth's advice in this. Whatever commitment you make to a co-founder, it's going to be finite. It'll eventually end. Your company will shut down or get acquired, or one or both of you will decide not to do this anymore, whether on purpose or one of you leaves, you guys agree not to do it anymore, or one of you passes away. That's just the deal. It's kind of like a marriage. You think about marriage, that's a co-foundership. I've had both, right? Trust me, they're way more similar than most of us give credit for. So number one, remember that every co-founder agreement is finite. Eventually, you're gonna be playing End of the Road by Boys to Men, just like my high school prom. It's gonna happen, right? So number one, everything is finite. Number two, realize that that contract's only going to come up when you have a problem. If you guys are cool, just like a marriage, if you guys are cool, you're not looking at how you're going to split up the assets because you don't think you're going to split things up, right? You're not going to be looking at the co-founder agreement when everything's rosy and you guys are both happy, or all of you, because I had 3 co-founders in the past, all of you are rosy in the business. No, you're going to look when there's trouble. Gary Keller talks about this. He was on the Tim Ferriss podcast. He says, your agreements should be called disagreements because you only read them when you disagree with something. Had to write it down. Brilliant. Now, Gary Keller is the co-founder of Keller Williams. If you're in the home business at all, if you bought a home like I have, or if you're in any type of residential neighborhood, you've heard of Keller Williams. So he's been through it. He talks about it on the podcast, really good podcast, about some of his adventures and issues that he had with the co-founder and other co-founders, obviously the Williams and Keller Williams. But this is brilliant. The point is that you're going to have issues eventually, and that's when the contract is going to come up. You need to view it as something that's going to make those potential issues in the future clear. One of my favorite adages is that the best medicine man in the village isn't well known and doesn't have the notoriety because his patients always feel better. His patients are never sick. He does the proactive stuff. The ones that you hear about, the ones that have the reputation, they happen to occur because they're more reactive, or whatever they tried to do didn't work. The best known things, to quote Dan Heath in Upstream, one of my favorite books right now, is that the upstream work, the work that you do proactively, it doesn't get the credit. A good co-founder contract, it doesn't get the credit. You might not even think it's a good contract because the stuff that's in there already saw ahead, already had the vision of the issues that you and your co-founder will have. So the best co-founder contracts, you don't have to pull them out because you already negotiated it, right? With Cutler and some of my other contracts, we already saw how things could split apart. We already, again, with Cutler, we already split up the shares. So if one of us wanted to leave, we knew the other 2 needed to buy this person out. That was already discussed. It's clarity. The best contractual agreements don't have to be pulled out because you guys already talked about stuff. So when there's rocky seas, and there's always rocky seas when it comes to partnerships, that's just the game of life, then you'll be able to look at that and say, oh yeah, we already talked about that. If we take this route, we'll do this decision. Done. Do that before you make that full commitment. Otherwise, when it gets to that finite part, when it gets to a disagreement, that's going to be way messier than it needs to be. And unfortunately, the person that's going to be paid the most, as they always say, are the lawyers. If you want more insight as far as how to negotiate these types of things, I think it actually pours into emotional intelligence. Us having the emotional intelligence to say, This partnership may not last forever. There might be a point where we'll disagree on something. It's taking the rose-colored glasses off. There's a great playlist that I have, with about a dozen or so videos. It's featuring Brene Brown and other folks talking about emotional intelligence. That's what we're really talking about in this video. I highly recommend you check out the playlist. Again, it's about a dozen videos. They're each about 10 minutes long. It's Brene, it's Oprah, it's a lot of one-name people. I think Simon Sinek's in there. Let's call him Sinek, is in there. Be sure and check it out. If you're liking the content, be sure and throw a like, share it with other folks, and subscribe. It is free, and it's every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 11:30 a.m. Vegas time. And I'd love to give you more insight about being a solopreneur, a side hustler, and your best self in the business community. And until next time, remember to bring your worth, and that you can always build from now. Take care.